Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on what part of the globe you're on and what time zone you're in. Just wait for a few people to come in and we'll start the broadcast. And we're going to start the broadcast right. We're going to do Paul Masson's Peach Brandy. Now, Dan, you'll be proud of me if you're listening. I did get some Four Roses bourbon, so that'll be on my next live. We'll do Four Roses bourbon. I'll try it out, check it out for the first time. I will try Four Roses. Hey, Jonah, how's it going? So I'm going to try to bounce from platform to platform and see how things go. Today, we're going to be reading the first chapter of The Founding Myth. All right, by Andrew Seidel. I started it last week and I only got through, let's see, I managed to get through the opening, the forward, and the introduction. So we're going to do chapter 1, see how far we get. It's a very short chapter. I'm almost tempted to read into chapter 2, but I don't want to burn anybody out. So yeah, we'll just do one chapter for today. Chapter 1 will be fine. So yes, you're looking at bed hair today. So without further ado, that's nice and sweet. Nice and sweet peach. So without further ado, we'll get into the reading. Andrew Seidel. The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. All right. I guess that's all that's going to show up for today. So we'll just go ahead and start reading. Chapter is Interesting and Irrelevant and Religion of the Founders. Interesting and Irrelevant, the Religion of the Founders. Quote, the foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. George Washington, June 8, 1783. Doesn't really jive with the kneeling in the snow painting now, does it? Get some more light in here. All right. Washington, you know, is gone, announced Mason Locke Weems, an Episcopal priest, to his Philadelphia publisher. The indecent glee of Weems' exclamation point was matched by the unseemly haste with which he wrote. Penning his note in mid-January, a month after Washington's death, on December 14th, 1799. In that exclamatory note, Weems told his publisher, millions are gaping to read something about him. I am very nearly primed and cocked for him. In an earlier exchange, Weems proposed publishing biographies of the American revolutionaries' military stars, which would, without doubt, sell an immense number. Weems had reason to know. In addition to preaching, Weems sold school books, almanacs, and popular literature as he wandered the new United States. He also published salacious tracts on gambling and masturbation, God's Revenge Against Gambling, and the apparent ribald tract entitled Onania. Historian Sylvia Neely has observed that Weems recognized the money-making potential of school books and wanted to produce exciting stories of adventure and romance that young people would devour. Weems was interested in profit, not accuracy. When Weems published A History of the Life and Death, Virtues, and Exploits of General George Washington in 1800, it was a commercial venture. He wrote that people wanted to read, and it worked. For more sensationalist than truthful, the book sold well, going through some 80 editions. Holy shit. Weems expanded the initially small pamphlet in those subsequent editions. One edition is the book's most well-known story, that Washington couldn't tell a lie about a cherry tree. Ironically, given its moral, the story is untrue. By the 17th edition, another Weemsian fable was added. General Washington praying in the Valley Forge snow. Right on cue. According to Weems' story, in a dark natural bower of ancient oaks, Washington was discovered praying aloud on his knees in prayer. The story was repeated and reprinted with no regard for truth. Its proliferation accelerated during the nation's religious revival from 1820 to 1860. That revival, referred to as the Second Great Awakening, was itself an indication that the founding generation was not as religious as the Christian nationalists often argue. Only those who are asleep can awaken. For decades, America's best-selling school textbooks, The McGuffey Reader, edited by educator William Holmes McGuffey, and later reprinted by Henry Ford. An interesting note about Henry Ford. If this is the same Henry Ford I'm thinking of, Henry Ford was also known. He was I believe, the owner and operator of the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford liked to include a book in each of the vehicles that he sold, and the book title was The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And this was a very, very, very salacious book, meant to excite and to arouse suspicion of the Jews and the supposed communist takeover. So he liked to include that book, and I think that book helped spark an unnatural basically the anti-Semitistic feelings of the United States. In fact, all the way up until the 30s, there was a very anti-Semitism was probably at an all-time high in the American zeitgeist. And Henry Ford was one of those people that helped promulgate that. He was one of the ones that were stoking the fires of anti-Semitism. We don't have time to go into all the history here, but interesting. Including the Valley Forge story, ensuring that it would be read by millions of children. McGuffey was also an ordained Presbyterian minister and used his textbooks to inculcate religion. For McGuffey, Christianity was the religion of our country. On its doctrines are founded the peculiarities of our free institutions. He warned teachers and parents to avoid teaching to our pupils the crude notions that revolutionary principles of modern infidelity. As Edward G. Lengel wrote in the Washington Papers, noted, in retelling Weems' stories, McGuffey simplified their morals and turned them into generic Sunday school lessons, putting Washington's piety on constant display. McGuffey's work led to other displays of Washington's conjured piety. The Valley Forge prayer scene has been painted by Lambert Sachs in 1854, Henry Bruckner in 1866, L.C. Leyendecker in 1935, and Arnold Friberg in 1975. It appeared on stamps in 1928 and in 1977. George Washington Memorial Chapel was founded in Valley Forge in 1903, partly to commemorate the inspiring image of a solitary, steadfast Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge. The U.S. Capitol's Congressional Prayer Room, built in 1955, features a stained glass window depicting the scene. Ronald Reagan called the image of Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge the most sublime picture in American history. Unfortunately, it was the most untrue, one of the most untrue, but we won't quibble over facts. Why do that, right? For all its ubiquity, there is no historical evidence to support the tale. Weems designed the story to portray a devout Washington. In Lengel's enlightening book, Inventing George Washington, he writes over and over, Weems emphasized Washington's Christian upbringing, frequent prayers, and spiritual dependence on God. But historical facts tell of a different Washington. He was a man of little or no religion with a strong character that, had he been religious, would have prevented showy religious displays. Washington avoided referring to Jesus Christ in his letters, attended religious services irregularly, did not kneel during prayer, and often dodged out of church before communion, according to Lengel. On the rare occasions when Washington actually attended church, perhaps 12 times a year pre-presidency and only 3 times in his last 3 years, Washington refused to take communion even though his wife did. Bishop William White officiated in some of the churches Washington occasionally attended. When asked specifically if Washington was a communicant of the Protestant Episcopal Church, Wright wrote, "Truth requires me to say that General Washington never received the communion, and the churches of which I am the parochial minister, Mrs. Washington was a habitual communicant." The bishop concluded that in another letter that no degree of recollection will bring to my mind any fact which would prove General Washington to have been a believer in the Christian revelation. Washington refused to have a priest or religious rituals at his deathbed, a startling lapse if he were truly devout. As historian Joseph Ellis puts it, there were no ministers in the room, no prayers uttered, no Christian rituals offering the solace of everlasting life. He died as a Roman Stoic rather than a Christian saint. If he was religious, Washington was exceedingly private about those beliefs, even in personal letters and papers. He mentions Jesus perhaps once in 90 volumes of letters and papers, and never in private correspondence. The ostentatious show Weems invented is simply not in keeping with Washington's strong, silent character. As Ron Chernow, Washington's Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer notes, Washington, a life. Some of Washington's religious style probably reflected an Enlightenment discomfort with religious dogma, but it also reflected his low-key personal style. He was sober and temperate in all things, distrusted zealotry, and would never have talked of hellfire or damnation. He would have shunned anything, such as communion, that might flaunt his religiosity. He never wanted to make a spectacle of his faith or trade on it as a politician. Simply as a matter of personal style, he would have refrained from the emotional language associated with evangelical Christianity. This cooler, more austere religious manner was commonplace among well-heeled Anglicans in 18th century Virginia. In Weemism myth, the Weemsian myth is disrespectful, particularly when one understands how Washington worked ceaselessly to perfect his own character, because the fable reflects Weems' character, not Washington's. As W. W. Abbott, another editor of Washington's papers, explains, more than most, Washington's biography is the story of a man constructing himself. Washington worked tirelessly to better himself. He woke early, studied etiquette, and sought to improve his own manners, deliberately mastered elegant penmanship, fastidiously attended to his personal appearance, and carefully weighed options before deciding. He personified measured self-control, silence, thoughtful deliberation, though he was apparently a sight to behold when he lost his temper. The character Weems portrays is a shade. Those who would honor Washington ought to condemn these myths and remember what Abigail Adams said on his death. Simple truth is his greatest eulogy. The prayer story. As historian Francois Furstenberg notes, almost certainly sprung from Weems' imagination, But Weems was not writing to capture Washington's true character. He wanted to capture on the name and death of a greater man, to write about what people wanted to buy. But the story survives for reasons other than Weems' initial pecuniary interest. By imbuing Washington's hard-won character with the kind of ostentatious piety he shunned, it dragged the incomparable leader down to an imitable level. Perhaps sensing something too stern and difficult about the real Washington, Weems tried to humanize him through treacly fables, suggests Chernow. This facile reflected glory is why the fraudulent scene hangs in the Capitol prayer room, why Reagan gushed over a lie, and why all a politician need do is claim to be a prayerful Christian, and he is suddenly Washington's equal. Sound familiar? Sounds like the image Trump supporters want to, basically they want to make Trump supporters who want to make Trump more than what he is, to make him more than, I don't know. It's just, it gets better and better, does it not? Excuse me for one moment. Sorry. I just could not stand seeing myself washed out. It was just, the light was just glaring right in my eyes. So I'll try to read without the overhead light. Anyway. And, this also reminds me of Jack Chick. Anybody remember Jack Chick from the 80s and 90s? And even in the early 2000s, he was a millionaire. He became a millionaire by writing his Chick tracts, basically these small little booklets with cartoons. And basically most of them were embellished stories, embellished testimonies of people who became Christians. And basically they were meant to scare little kids of going to hell. I remember reading Jack Chick tracts as a kid, and I was hooked on them for a long while. And even my own pastor made a brief mention of embellished stories that he tried to get answers to, like fictionalized stories of near-death experiences and going to hell and waking up. And, there was a story of one of his characters dies, is clinically dead. He goes to hell, is tortured, and then he comes back to life while he's lying in the morgue. And yeah, it was just strange stories like that. And so even my own pastor, who was skeptical of that, tried calling the Jack Chick organization to get answers. And no one can confirm where that story came from. And it's not surprising. How's it going, Jonah and Sammy? Good to see you all. All right, let's continue. Weems Salvo began a long written war between authors and historians over the founders' religiosity. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, and others are invoked in the attempt to claim this nation is Christian because they were Christian. This spiritual wrangling has a checkered history, with each generation repeating the falsehoods of the earlier, including Weems. Though interesting, the battle over what the founders personally believed is relevant to the claim that our nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, that the founders had personal beliefs about religion, and God does not prove that they used these principles to found a nation. Nor should we make the mistake of assuming that their religious beliefs were static throughout their lives. People's beliefs change. Two of my good friends, authors Dan Barker and Jerry DeWitt, were once preachers and are now atheists. It is unlikely that at age 58, Washington had the same beliefs he held at 18. Even were we to concede, for the sake of argument, that the founders were all Christian, the logic required to prove the Christian nationalist argument is flawed. Major premise: the founders were all devout. The founders were all devout. Jesus has risen Christians. Minor premise: the founders established this nation. Conclusion: therefore, this nation is a Christian nation founded on Judeo-Christian principles. One's personal theistic beliefs do not own the other ideas generated by one's mind. By that same logic, blue jeans would be Jewish blue jeans because the inventors of the pants, Jacob W. Davis and Levi Strauss, happen to be Jewish. If we follow this logic, that a person's religion informs all of their own ideas, why limit it to religion? Why not argue that America is a nation of hair powders and wig wearers? And why not limit the logic to suggesting that religion informs the nation? Why not claim that the founders built a Christian outhouse or planted a Judeo-Christian vegetable garden? Of course, designing a nation is different from designing a pair of jeans, but religion cannot be assumed to influence either. Those religious beliefs must be examined and compared against the principles that inform the design. To argue that the founders were Christian is irrelevant because it does not answer the ultimate question about Christianity's influence on America's founding. And even if the founders were all Christian and this fallacious logic held, we know that they never cited biblical principles during the Constitutional Convention and ratifications, as we'll see in Chapter 6. The religious faith of the founders is irrelevant for another reason. They made it irrelevant when they erected a wall of separation between religion and the government they created. The Constitution deliberately rejects commingling religion and government. The Constitution's severed religious power from the government to limit the danger it would pose, separates church and state. Prohibits a religious test for public office, and as Alexander Hamilton put it, gives the president no particle of spiritual jurisdiction. The same is true of Congress. It has limited enumerated powers, no scintilla of which are religious. Two facts illustrate the founders' intentions to build this wall. First, our Constitution is deliberately godless. There is no references to gods, goddesses, or divine intervention. The omission was not an oversight. The supernatural power was rejected in favor of the natural power contained in the first three words, we the people. Civil War Colonel, author, and orator Robert Ingersoll best captured the deliberate beauty of this omission. They knew that to put God in the Constitution was to put man out. They knew that the recognition of a deity would be seized upon by fanatics and zealots as a pretext for destroying the liberty of thought. They knew the terrible history of the church too well to place in her keeping and in the keeping of her God the sacred rights of man. They intended that all should have the right to worship or not to worship, that our laws should make no distinction on account of creed. They intended to found and frame a government for man and for man alone. They wished to preserve the individuality and liberty of all, to prevent the few from governing the many, and the many from persecuting and destroying the few. Very well stated. The second fact is that our Constitution's only references to religion are exclusionary. It excludes the state from involving itself in religion, the First Amendment Free Exercise Clause, and excludes religion from involving itself in the state, the First Amendment Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The separation of state and church was woven into the constitutional design even before the First Amendment was drafted. The prohibition on religious tests in Article 6, Clause 3, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any offer or public trust under the United States. was the only mention of religion in the original document. The Constitution often uses malleable language, but this prohibition is the most emphatic statement in the document. No, shall, ever, any. These words are a mandate. Joseph Story, Supreme Court Justice from 1812 to 1845, wrote the first definitive commentaries on the Constitution. He explained that the clause was not introduced merely for the purpose of satisfying the scruples of many respectable persons who feel inevitable repugnance to any religious test. According to Story, it had a higher objective to cut off forever every pretense of an alliance between church and state in the national government. Divorcing religion from government offices was so important that the U.S. Congress edited the word God out of its oath of office. The first bill Congress passed under the Constitution that President George Washington signed into law in June 1789 was an act to regulate the time and manner of administering certain oaths. As originally proposed, it had two clauses mentioning God. In the presence of Almighty God, and so help me God. Neither made the final cut, and the oath remains godless until 1862. Now that's interesting. So help me God comes back. Because remember, when we look at the oath, what do we hear? What do we hear when we hear the oath of office? So help you God. Isn't that interesting? When did that start? Well after the fact. The federal experiment with state church separation was so successful that the states began to follow along. Other than New York and Virginia, arguably the two most important, the original states had religious tests for public office, and none had godless constitutions. But they also all predated the federal constitution. As they updated and amended those constitutions, the states began to follow the federal model of state-church separation, abolishing religious tests for public office, prohibiting taxpayer funds from flowing to churches and houses of worship. And with the separation and secularization, guaranteeing the freedom of religion. There is no freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. The idea of government separate from religion was floating around during the Enlightenment. John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, the greats of the day discussed it. But while other ideas in political science had real-world antecedents on which the founders could rely, there was no example of a truly secular government. No other nation had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating the government from religion and religion from the government. Until the theory was put into practice, true freedom of thought and even freedom of religion could not have existed. The United States realized those concepts because it embarked upon a great and noble experiment, hazarded in the absence of all previous precedent, that of total separation of church and state, according to President John Tyler. America was the first nation to try this experiment. It invented the separation of state and church. Pulitzer Prize winner author Gary Wills puts it nicely. The separation, more than anything else, made the United States a new thing on earth, setting new tasks for religion, offering it new opportunities. Everything else in our Constitution, separation of powers, balanced government, bicameralism, federalism, had been anticipated both in theory and practice, but we invented nothing except disestablishment. No other government in history had launched itself without the help of officially recognized gods and their state-connected ministers. America should celebrate this great American principles of eternal separation. It's ours. It's an American original. We ought to be proud of that contribution to the world, not bury it under myths. The founders' private religious beliefs are far less important to the Judeo-Christian question than their views on separating state and church and the actions they took to divorce those two institutions. They were as close to consensus on separating the two as they were on any subject. In the first volume of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published the same year that America declared independence, historian Edward Gibbon, I recognize that name, wrote that the various forms of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people to be equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, by the magistrate as equally useful. Most of the founders agreed with Gibbon and recognized that religion can be exploited for political gain, and religion, when it has civil power, is often deadly. These beliefs were common among the founders, but not universal. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration, believed that the Christian religion should be preferred to all others, and that every family in the United States should be furnished at public expense with a copy of an American edition of the Bible. However, in spite of, or likely because of, their divergent religious beliefs and backgrounds, the founders thought that the separation made sense. George Washington promised that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny. Every man ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience. A few weeks after issuing the nation's first Thanksgiving proclamation, a Congress official command, Washington responded to a letter from a Presbyterian minister in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. They expressed their approval for the Thanksgiving proclamation and their dismay that some explicit acknowledgement of the one true God in Jesus Christ was absent from the American Magna Carta, the Constitution. In his response, Washington observed that the path of true piety is so plain as to require but little political direction. To this consideration, we ought to ascribe the absence of any regulation respecting religion from the Magna Carta of our country. We continue writing of piety to the guide. He continued writing of piety to the guidance of the ministers of the gospel. This important object is perhaps more properly committed. Washington thought that the religion was best left to the private sphere. He defended the Constitution's godlessness. The government would give every furtherance to morality and science, which might incidentally advance religion, but religion was a personal, not a government matter. I have to admire George Washington's ability to navigate around landmines such as this. I have to admire his. He's very. I'll tell you, he is a politician's politician, and he maneuvered beautifully. That was very well done. Continuing, the Constitution separated state and church even before the First Amendment reinforced that separation, as Alexander Hamilton explained in The Federalist. Advocating ratification of the Constitution, Hamilton compared the powers of the new office of President of the United States to the powers of the King of Great Britain. The one has no particle of spiritual jurisdiction. The other is the supreme head and governor of the national church, he exclaimed. Hamilton sounded on a theme that was so resonant straight through the Revolution and beyond, that the best government posture toward religion was of passive tolerance, not active promotion of an established church. According to Ron Chernow, who is Hamilton's biographer as well as Washington's, I thought I recognized Chernow's name. That is correct. He also wrote the biography of Hamilton. Interesting. He also did Washington, and if I'm not mistaken, he did Thomas Jefferson as well. But I don't want to jump ahead. That's interesting. Yeah, he is probably one of the top biographers of the founding fathers. That's interesting. Jefferson wrote the very metaphor our courts use to interpret the government's relation to religion. Quote, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, the First Amendment, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion, on prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, unquote. Jefferson also authored the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, upon which the First Amendment would be based. That law, along with the University of Virginia and the Declaration of Independence, were the only achievements he wanted inscribed on his gravestone. The statute guaranteed religious freedom by guaranteeing a secular government. In the statute, Jefferson skewered, quote, the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who, being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, wow, ouch, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, unquote. The law ensured, 1, that there would be no government support of religion to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. 2, that the government should not take away a citizen's right because of their opinion on religion. Our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. And 3, that religious tests for public office were prohibited, prescribing any citizen as unworthy of the public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity, unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is deriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which he has a natural right. In 1785, 6 years after Jefferson first proposed the statute for religious freedom, Madison shepherded it through the state legislature, as he would later push the First Amendment through the House, making Virginia the first state to separate government and religion. The statute was unique in another respect. It was less a declaration of positive law and more a declaration of a natural right. The rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. Relying on natural law to protect rights was a Jeffersonian motif, as we shall see in chapters 3 and 4, the Declaration of Independence. I cannot wait to get to chapters 3 and 4. If anybody knows anything about Jefferson, you'll know that he was very, very, very anti-religion. In fact, just look up the Jefferson Bible, and you'll see what he thought of religion. And don't worry, I will be getting to your comments as soon as I can, as soon as I'm done with the chapter. Two more pages to go. Here we go. Madison is not only the father of the Constitution and the father of the Bill of Rights, but also perhaps the greatest advocate for the separation of state and church. Quote, every new and successful example, therefore, of a perfect separation between ecclesiastical and civil matters is of importance, unquote. He wrote in 1822, adding, quote, and I have no doubt that every new example will succeed, as every past one has done, in the showing that religious and government will both exist in greater purity, the less they are mixed together, unquote. I'm going to read that again. And I have no doubt that every new example will succeed, as every past one has done, in showing that religion and government will both exist in greater purity, the less they are mixed together. That's James Madison. Interesting. Madison argued that the separation existed as much to protect religion as to protect government. In response to a sermon he received from a New York clergyman, Madison wrote that the United States is a happy disproof of the error so long rooted in the unenlightened minds of the well-meaning Christians, as well as in the corrupt hearts of persecuting usurpers. that without legal incorporation of religious and civil uh, polity, neither could be supported. As president, Madison vetoed two bills granting land to churches. He set down the reason for his vetoes in an 1811 letter to several Baptist churches in North Carolina. He wrote that he had, quote, always regarded the practical distinction between religion and civil government as essential to the purity of both, as guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, unquote. For Madison, the tendency of government and religion to mix and corrupt each other is so great that the danger cannot be too carefully guarded against. And yes, we have the Catholic Church to look up to in that regard. What better example? What better example than the Catholic Church in any basic, or the Church of England, as an example of the corruption of both government and religion by mixing the two together? Wow, who knew? And you know what? I, for one, agree with that. When you mix the two together, you're in for a bad time. You're in for a bad time. All right, let's keep going. James Madison also wrote the greatest defense of the wall of separation. He anonymously published an essay in 1785, Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, convinced the people of Virginia to vote against the bill, giving financial support to Christian ministers. The Supreme Court consistently cites the memorial when interpreting the religious clauses of the First Amendment. Pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, and both superstition, bigotry, and persecution were the fruits of 15 centuries of established Christianity. Madison wrote, echoing Gibbons, he observed, rulers also wish to subvert the public liberty, may have found in established clergy convenient auxiliaries, but it wasn't just about keeping religion out of government. Madison urged the government not to legislate religious matters either. Doing so implies either that the civil magistrate is a competent judge of religious truth, or that he may employ religion as an engine of civil policy. The first is an arrogant pretension. The second is an unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation. Separation benefits all sides. Hear, hear. Incidentally, according to the Episcopal Bishop of Virginia, William Meade, who knew the Madison family, James Madison's religious feelings were short-lived because of his political association with those of infidel principles, of whom there were many in his day. Oh my. Yikes. So the Episcopal Bishop of Virginia didn't take kindly to James Madison. Yikes. According to the bishop, at least, infidel principles, not Judeo-Christian principles, influenced the father of the Constitution. Yikes. That the founders sought to build this wall of separation does not necessarily mean that they were personally irreligious. One can be religious and endorse the separation. Indeed, many minority religious sects favored separation at the founding. Madison's 1811 letter to the Baptist churches of North Carolina explaining his church land grant veto was actually a reply. Those churches had written first to congratulate Madison for vetoing a grant of public land to the Baptist church at Salem Meeting House, Mississippi Territory. Baptists were objecting to the public land going to Baptists and thanking the president for vetoing the deal. That is interesting. Baptists were happy that other Baptist churches were denied land from the government. Now, that is interesting to note. It's interesting because the Freedom from Religion Foundation often cites that there are religious people that support their endeavors. They know the dangers of one sect of Christianity gaining control of the government and thus saying our interpretation of Scripture is therefore right and should be law. Sound familiar? That sounds like the fundamentalist Christian white nationalists. Oh, that happens to be the same group that Andrew Seidel is writing about. So that tells me that these Baptist ministers were not, they definitely were not stupid. They definitely knew the dangers that, basically, they knew the dangers that could be imposed if religion were to gain a foothold in the government. Yes, there would be short-term gains, but long-term losses. What happens if the Catholic? I think these certain Baptist ministers knew that what happened if Catholics were to gain the upper hand? What if they were to gain the minority in the government? They damn sure almost made it in the South. In the Deep South, Catholicism was at an all-time high. So these Baptists they thought further than the end of their own nose and said, wait a minute, that's dangerous. Even if it benefits us, that's not good. Even if we were to get the upper hand we're granted lands and tax monies, that could backfire on us in a few generations. So there were some thinking religious people that said, no, that's not a good thing. Thank you, James Madison, for vetoing that. In reply, Madison commended the Baptist sect for favoring separationism. That's amazing. Baptists back in the day used to believe in separatism. Religion, government, separate. That, I'm telling you what, in the Baptist church I came from was the absolute opposite of that. They believed that the more religion, the more of the Baptist interpretation of Scripture influences the government, the better. That's the church I came from. It's amazing. These Baptists were much more enlightened than those of today. Madison writes, among the various religious societies in our country, none has been more vigilant or constant in maintaining that distinction than the society of which you make a part. And it is an honorable proof of your sincerity and integrity that you are ready to do so in case of favoring the interests of your brethren, as in other cases. Even some Roman Catholics were for strict separation. Oh, that is surprising. When the first Congress was debating the First Amendment, one of only 3 Catholics in Congress, Representative Daniel Carroll in Maryland, was very much in favor of the separation because the rights of conscience are, in their nature, of peculiar delicacy and will little bear the gentlest touch of governmental hand. How very learned and astute. Senator Charles Carroll of Maryland and Representative Thomas Fitzsimmons of Pennsylvania were of the other 2 Catholics out of 90 members. Regardless of their personal religious beliefs, the founders chose to safeguard liberty by building a wall of separation between church and state. And according to Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, writing an opinion in 1948, separation means separation, not something less. Jefferson's metaphor in describing the relation between church and state speaks of a wall of separation, not a fine line easily overstepped. Separation is not a one-way street that allows religion to influence government while preventing government from influencing religion. Very well said. It is a wall preventing religion from tainting government as well. State and church will both exist in greater purity and the less they are mixed together, as Madison explained. Damn straight. I'm telling you what, I want to jump ahead to chapter 2, we're going to save that for next week. We're going to save the best for next week, because 3 and 4 are going to be awesome chapters. And I can't wait to get to them, because it's amazing. It is amazing how many religious people were actually thinking that far ahead. They said, no, we don't want any religious influence in the government, and we don't want any government influence in religion. They realized that it was a two-way street. You can't, I mean, you're going to have it both ways, whether you like it or not. If religion wants to influence the government, that government is going to then influence religion. It all depends on who's in charge at the time. That is damn smart. That is awesome. So I for one I am thankful for the founding fathers' forethought into that. Yes, they were people of, how shall I say this? They were they were a mixed bag. You had those that were slave owners. We did have founding fathers who were slave owners, and people look at that and say, well, that's contradiction. You look at the Constitution, and on one hand it says all men are created equal. I would put forth the idea that was the starting point. That was at least a starting point where we could, in fact, do away with slavery. Unfortunately, some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson and I want to say George Washington, owned slaves. Madison did not, nor did John Adams. John Adams, that's another guy I would love to get into. But anyway, that's chapter 1 for today. So if you weren't able to get to the beginning of the broadcast, go to the beginning and review. I just finished chapter 1 of The Founding Myth by Andrew L. Seidel, and next week I cannot wait to get to chapter 2. I might even start it on Thursday or Friday. I don't know. We'll see if I can wait till Saturday. But anyway, thank you for all for watching. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. And I will see you later. Don't know when, but it'll definitely be later when I do. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll talk to you all later. Take care now.